Today we're going to be starting our focus study on the book of James. And for those of you who were here at first, you heard several minutes from Philip that are going to be just almost word for word what I have. So if you want to have a quick little nap, you can wake up in a few minutes and you won't have missed much. But today we want to look at background. We'll get into the text next week. The book of James, we know that someone named James wrote it. Now, there would be some people who will take issue with that. We'll look at that later. But he describes himself as a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. How did Paul open up his books? Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. This James could have described himself as a leader. He could have described himself, I think, as a brother of the Lord, but he didn't. A servant. And William Barclay said that if a person is a servant of God, then he is associated with some really great people. Let's look at a few. Moses, Solomon, when he was dedicating the temple, in 1 Kings chapter 8, Solomon described Moses as being a servant of God. Caleb, that was by God himself. You'll recall the story, the 12 spies sent out into the land of Canaan, and they came back, and they said, oh, it's just a great place, it's just fabulous. But 10 of them said, we can't take it. Those people are big. I mean, here we are like shrimps, and they look like NFL linemen. We can't take that place. And Joshua and Caleb said, oh, we can, because God is with us. The other 10 said, we can't. And the people wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb. And in Numbers 14, the next chapter, God describes Caleb as being his servant because he had a different spirit. He had a can-do spirit instead of a defeated spirit. Caleb can do it. And Caleb was obedient to me. He's my servant. Or Job. God called Job his servant in Job chapter 1 and verse 8. And he described Job as being a blameless and an upright man. Or Moses, describing the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being servants of God. What was Moses doing at the time? He was interceding with God after that sad affair with that golden calf. This is the retelling of it in Deuteronomy chapter 9 and verse 27, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are servants. What greater honor, really, could we have than to be called a servant of God, people doing the work of the Master? That's how James described himself. There were two apostles named James. James, the author of this book, certainly not the first one. Probably not the second one. Who was the first one? Well, it was James, who had a brother named John, sons of Zebedee. And they were 2/3 of Jesus' inner circle. You remember the inner circle. Peter, James, and John. And they were there alone with Christ during some really significant events, like the raising of Jairus' daughter. Those three. The Transfiguration was those three. Gethsemane, they were the ones who went farther into the garden with Jesus. So that James died almost certainly too early to have written this book. Some estimates are that he died in AD 42. Some others AD 44, certainly not after 44. And this book would have been written somewhat after that. So it wasn't James, brother of John, son of Zebedee. There was another. He was called James, son of Alphaeus. He was also called James the Less. Now that could mean two things. That could mean that James the Less was younger than James, the son of Zebedee. Or maybe it could mean that his nickname would have been Shorty. It's one of the two. He was either short or he was younger, or maybe he was both. But at any rate, he was James the Less. Nothing is said in the scriptures about James the Less other than the fact that he was an apostle. Doesn't tell us anything that he did. And so I think it's unlikely that he would have come out of such obscurity to be the author of this book. Possible, but unlikely. But I think we would have to say, if we had been chosen as an apostle of Jesus Christ, wouldn't we have taken that as being a great honor? Well, certainly so. So, James, son of Alphaeus, even though virtually nothing is written about him, he was honored by Jesus to be an apostle. Well, that leaves us with a third choice. Only got three, and we've eliminated two. James, the brother of Jesus. Now, he could be brother and be a stepbrother. Some commentators suggest that Mary was Joseph's second wife, that Joseph had been married, his wife had died, but they had children. And James could have been one of them. That's a possibility. Another is that James was the physical son of Mary, meaning that Jesus was his older half-brother. Could have been a step, could have been a half. Whatever he was, we know that he had siblings, and we know that he initially did not believe. The best account of that is given in Matthew chapter 13. Toward the end of the chapter, Matthew 13, you may recall, is the parables chapter. But at the end, it's narrative. Jesus has gone back to Nazareth. Starting in verse 54, when he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, aren't they all with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" And they were offended at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own country and in his own house." James did not believe early on. And that's told to us specifically at the beginning of John chapter 7, verse 5, that his brothers did not believe in him. But something changed. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is writing about the appearances that Jesus made after his resurrection. And in verse 7, he says, he appeared to James. This was after he had appeared to the remaining apostles. He appeared to James, and then to other brethren also. And in Acts chapter 1, the 120, those were the believers at that point, were in the upper room. This was shortly after the ascension of Jesus. And James and his brothers were there. They were part of the 120. What happened? Well, the resurrection probably was a convincing fact. The resurrection to Saul wasn't a convincing fact. He would have heard of that. He didn't believe it. What convinced Saul was that appearance of Jesus to him on the road to Damascus. That's what convinced him that Jesus indeed was Lord. And it's certain that this appearance, specific appearance, that Jesus made to James, who was the oldest of those brothers, excluding Jesus, would have been a factor in his becoming a Christian. In the early church, this James, the brother of Jesus, was called the Just because of his emphasis. We'll see it in the book on social justice and moral living. That was his nickname. He was a strong leader. Some people called him the, prevailing elder. And those people who use terms somewhat loosely have a presiding elder called a bishop, and they'll call him the bishop. We don't have presiding elders. The Scripture doesn't teach us that we should have presiding elders. But James was certainly a leader and the spokesman of the Jerusalem church. In Acts chapter 12, Peter had been put in prison. Herod was going to bring him out the next day. That day would have been, in Peter's expectation, the pronouncement of sentence and a beheading. But instead, an angel released him. You remember that? And Peter went to the house of John Mark. I think it's safe to assume that John Mark came from a wealthy family because the church was meeting in his house, and they were praying for Peter. I don't think they were praying that Peter would be saved. They didn't expect that. They were just praying that Peter would remain strong. And all of a sudden, Peter is at the door, knocking on the door. And you remember that lady Rhoda who came to the door. She recognized the voice. She was so excited she didn't open the door. She ran off. Told people, Peter's at the door. Well, go let him in. So she goes back to the door. He doesn't come in. He tells him to be quiet. He doesn't want to raise a commotion. And he says, go tell this to James, leader in the church, and to the brethren. And that leadership was demonstrated clearly in Acts chapter 15. That was that Jerusalem Council, Jerusalem Conference, whatever you want to call it. Probably around AD 50, maybe a little later. Because the Jews were willing to accept, in general, the Gentiles at that point as Christians, but not really as Gentile Christians. They wanted them to be Jews. They're already Christians, but they're not Jews. We want them to be circumcised, become Jews, and then they will truly be our brothers. And James is the one who gave the decision of the church. They need to avoid things strangled and blood and immorality, but they don't have to be circumcised. James is the one who pronounced that. And church tradition, early church tradition, always attributes the authorship of this book to that James, the half-brother of Jesus. And he was apparently quite well known, and so he didn't feel the need to clarify himself any further. I am James, the half-brother of Jesus. I'm writing this book. He didn't feel that necessary. He didn't need to identify himself anymore. Now, there are counter-arguments to this, people arguing for another offer. William Barclay, whom I like, but sometimes says things that seem a little off the wall, says that the evidence is probably equal, just evenly balanced between this James and someone else. Adam Clark, whom I like, says the author is unknown. So it's an unknown James, or someone who adopted the name James to use for authority. That was known in the early church. We'll look at that briefly a little later. Authorship was really an aid to acceptance of a book. But it's not definitive. Think of the book of Hebrews. No author is claimed in the book of Hebrews. None is asserted. Some people say Paul. Some say Apollos. Some say some other names. The book of Hebrews doesn't say. So that's the author. Not definitive, but most likely half-brother of Jesus. What about the audience? To whom was it written? Well, it begins, I have to get over from Matthew, it begins by saying, to those who are scattered abroad, the 12 tribes scattered abroad. There are 7 general letters in the New Testament. James, 1st and 2nd Peter, the 3 epistles of John, and Jude. It is interesting that they are all at the end. I don't know what caused that, but that's where they are. And that term, general epistles, was first used by Eusebius, who was a church historian. This is about AD 300, and he called them Catholic letters. Don't let that scare you. Catholic just meant universal. They were general, they were Catholic, they were universal, because they weren't written to a specific person, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, not to a specific person, not to a specific church, not even to a group of churches, as was the case in Galatians. Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia. It was just a general letter. The primary audience, to me at least, was Jewish Christians. That's my reading of verse 1. Not everyone agrees with that. But certainly the 12 tribes would logically refer to Jews. They were scattered. You've heard of the term diaspora. I've heard of the term, but I was putting the accent on the wrong syllable. That reminds me, I have to tell a story. High school band, my beloved band director, Walter C. Manier, Fair Park High School, Shreveport, Louisiana. Sometimes people would put the accent on the wrong note. And Mr. Manier would say that you put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. That's what I was doing with diaspora, because I had the accent on the third syllable, diaspora. I finally looked it up, and I was incorrect. Diaspora. They were scattered abroad with the two main invasions of the Holy Land. The first one was when the Assyrians came in 722, and then the Babylonians, who finished their destruction in 586, and they dispersed the Jews. And Adam Clarke said that even at that time, the dispersed Jews outnumbered the Jews in Judea. Well, we know for today that's certainly true. There are far more Jews in the world outside of Israel than there are in Israel. I think there are probably more Jews in the United States than there are in Israel. So they have been dispersed. And it's interesting that the book of Hebrews doesn't really address its audience, but it would really apply more to Jews, because it talks so much about the superiority of the new covenant. The main word in the book of Hebrews is better. Jesus is better. The new covenant is better. The promises are better. But the author of Hebrews doesn't focus that on Jewish readers. He's just assuming that they are taking note, I think. So I think he's referring to the diaspora, not to just Christian Jews only. If that had been the case, the spread would have been much narrower. So he's giving it to Jews, most of whom obviously would have been Christian. Now, that's my take. Burton Kaufman said that the addressees are not speaking really to Jews at all. It's the Israel of God, and that expression is used in Galatians 6 and verse 16. We are all Gentiles, but we are part of the Israel of God. And as support for that, Burton Kaufman refers to Matthew 19 and verse 28, where he talks about the apostles judging the 12 tribes of Israel. If the apostles are going to be involved at the judgment, we will be part of that, and we will be part of the Israel of God. Therefore, I guess symbolically, part of the 12 tribes. But whether he is aiming at Gentiles or Jews, it's obvious that this book is written for Christians. And we know that many Christians were scattered following the death of Stephen. And that would have taken place probably in the late 30s. And a great persecution arose. And Christians were scattered. And there are some commentators that say that scattering following the death of Stephen led to this book, set the stage. Those people believe that the book was written early. And there are good arguments for that. One of them is in James 2 and verse 2. And if you read that in your translation, you're probably going to see about someone coming into the assembly. In numbers of places in the New Testament, assembly is translated from the Greek ekklesia, a local church. Here, in James 2:2, it is translated from the Greek word synagogue. What does that sound like? Synagogue. We don't read it in the English, but it's there in the Greek. And it would seem obvious that early on, since Christianity began among the Jews, that Jewish terms, if they're going to be used at all, would be more likely in the early days. And here is synagogue. Thinking about the addressees for the book, there's no clear distinction made between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. There's no reference to controversies in the church, like the one addressed in the Jerusalem Conference, early 50s. Those controversies were in place before AD 60, well before. No reference to any of them. And so many conservative scholars date this book as written about AD 45. And if that is the case, it probably, this is from J.D. Davis in his Dictionary of the Bible, probably was the first New Testament book to be written. Now, it probably wasn't written long before the book of Galatians. And some people argue for Galatians as being first. But this may well have been the first book. Davis says 45. Merrill Tenney wrote a book, New Testament Survey. He dates it as 45, maybe as late as AD 50. And there are other people who put it in the same. Certainly, if the James, brother of Jesus, wrote it, it would have been written by AD 62, because it was in AD 62, shortly after the death of Festus, that this James was stoned to death. Josephus, Jewish historian, mentions his death. There are some people who propose a very late date, as late date as about AD 100. And they were probably influenced by who wrote it. I mentioned Barclay earlier. Barclay thinks that it was a edited and expanded version of a sermon that James delivered, but that James himself did not write it. Other people refer to the quality of the Greek, which, according to commentators, I wouldn't know, almost matches that of Luke. Luke wrote the best Greek in the New Testament, and James not far behind. And some say that the quality of Greek is too great for a person who grew up speaking Aramaic. That may or may not be true. And there are people whose native language is not English who speak marvelous English. I was astounded early last week hearing an interview on TV from a woman who was a government official in Sweden. She was doing the interview in English. She sounded like she had gone to school at Oxford, but she was Swedish. People can learn, and people can speak a marvelous second language, grammatically and every other way, with it being their second.
Don, could the book have been dictated to a Greek from James?
Jack asked, could the book have been dictated to a native Greek speaker? by James. We don't know, but that certainly could be, because we know that Paul did that. And at times, even the person who wrote the book said, I wrote this book as given to me by Paul. It is possible, certainly. I hadn't thought of that. Go to the head of the, well, you're already at the head of the class, so it's okay. No, you don't need to move up. James was accepted in the Scriptures fairly late as regards canonicity of the book. The first New Testament list was about 170 A.D. Yeah, it was called the Auditorium canon, and James is not there. It was first quoted by name by a man named Origen early in the 3rd century. Now that would be the early 200s. It was included in Jerome's translation, the Latin Vulgate, late 4th century, so that would be late 300s, and that was important. But that uncertainty over the author contributed to that, and it was in the well into the 200s before it was widely accepted. There was a class of books called pseudepigrapha, and I don't have a list in front of me by name right now. There were a lot of them, and they would take somebody's name who was well known and call them like the Gospel of Mark. Not our gospel, but a pseudepigraphic book claiming that Mark wrote it, but it really wasn't that Mark. If it had been done that way, those people they had to seek some authority somewhere. So they were no names, if you will, and they adopted a prominent name to give some validity to the book. Well, if it were pseudepigraphic, certainly the author would have said, I am James, I'm the half-brother of Jesus, if it had been pseudepigraphic. That would have gained some credibility. Some people, in doubting whether or not it belongs in the New Testament, point to the lack of Christian theology. Well, that's true. This book is not heavily theological. Think of a book that is. Romans. Harder to understand than James. It is not heavy on theology. It is heavy on morality and ethical living. And that is why I have heard that some of you have said, James is my favorite book. Well, why would that be? Our attention spans are short. James is short. James is easy to understand. He's very direct. James tells us things that we as Christians need to be and not be. He gives real guidance to our lives. That may be why it might be your favorite or among your favorite books. And although there's not heavy theology in there, there's not a lot of references to Jesus. Actually, there are just 2 mentions of his name. But commentators have found dozens of references to the teachings of Jesus in the book of James, particularly to the Sermon on the Mount. And there is also some overlap there with 1 Peter. There are similarities with some of the statements from the Old Testament, particularly Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And most of us like those books because of the messages that they contain. So the emphasis is ethical moral. It's not theology. But the text will be easy to understand, and we're not going to get into text today other than just that first verse, which is worth rereading. James, servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. Next week we'll pick up with the text.